In the far west of China, the monstrous crime is taking place. The mass incarceration.
The region is now under what's probably the most intense government surveillance in the world.
The story of these camps is also the story of China's efforts to cover them up.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert. You're watching a special edition of The Listening Post. It is not clear how many people are currently being held against their will by the state in the Chinese province of Xinjiang. However, conservative estimates put the number of ethnic Uighurs and other Muslim minorities held under some form of detention since 2017 at between 1 and 1.5 million. The apparent goal of the authorities to assimilate aggressively the minority Uyghur population with the majority Han Chinese. Beijing calls this its response to the threat of the, quote, three evils: extremism, terrorism, and separatism. The tools at the state's disposal, a combination of word-of-mouth informer-based surveillance and the latest technologies: facial recognition, voice pattern sequencing, DNA profiling, along with some good old-fashioned propaganda. Beijing and the media outlets it controls don't call them internment camps or prisons. They're centers for re-education or even thought transformation. Foreign media outlets are mostly locked out of the province or have seen their sources dry up or disappear. Getting an accurate, informative story out of there is not easy. Later in this program, we'll look at the effect that Uyghur journalists in the diaspora and internet sleuths outside of China have had on the news coverage. But first, the Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi with a look at the shifting narratives and the occasionally Orwellian language in the Chinese news media in defense of the state's policies and practices in Xinjiang.
Reporting in Xinjiang, in China's far northwest, feels like traveling in a war zone.
International reporting of this story began slowly. In 2017, journalists had already heard of a regime of surveillance in China's Xinjiang region, with body checks, facial recognition technology, and phone monitoring. But there were whispers about other, more disturbing developments.
People are really frightened of speaking out, so we've traveled to meet two Uyghurs who are willing to talk to us. But they've asked us not to say where they are.
Rumors of mass detentions of Uyghurs, stories of vast camps, and of people vanishing for years.
The UN said that it had received credible reports of some 1 million Uyghurs being held in internment camps.
The silence from the Chinese state was deafening. Initially, it had nothing to say. Then came the denials, including at the United Nations.
The argument that 1 million Uighurs are detained in re-education centers is completely untrue.
By late 2018, though, the journalism had become more detailed.
3 years ago, this area was just a patch of dirt. Today, it's a detention centre measuring more than 500,000 square metres.
The reporting was much more difficult to refute, and it forced a change in Beijing's messaging strategy. On October 16, 2018, the Chinese state broadcaster CCTV aired a 15-minute documentary about what they called vocational training centers.
新疆依照有关法律法规的规定，通过职业技能教育培训的方式，开展了源头治理的探索。
It told the story of what the Chinese government wanted to communicate about what was happening in Xinjiang, which was there was radical extremism, there was terrorism, there was ethnic separatism.
当和政府及时发现了我，救了我，给我一次改过自新的机会，我非常感谢。
The government was fighting this as part of this worldwide battle against terrorism, was how they framed it.
You had a number of pieces in nationalist publications like Global Times. You had Xinhua. So all of a sudden you see both this Chinese language media push, not so much acknowledging that there are Uyghurs who are in detention, but kind of trying to spin it basically into something that's a softer, more voluntary form of detention.
And then there was also the cultural aspect, which is the idea that they are not, stifling Uyghur culture, they are preserving it.
为了丰富学员们的课余生活，职业技能教育培训中心还成立了阳光文工团，聘请专业老师培训有艺术爱好的学员。
People are allowed to do ethnic dances, make their traditional bread, make their traditional rugs.
So their narrative has been changing over time. based on how international community has been responding, reacting. So this public misinformation campaign started last August, and it's happening to this day.
Nuri Turkel is Uyghur. He advocates and campaigns for Uyghur rights from his base in Washington, D.C. Turkel has been dissecting the Chinese official narrative around Xinjiang for years. He and other analysts point to a framework of institutional Islamophobia and a sense of superiority amongst the country's ethnic majority, the Han Chinese. They say this underlies the narrative of extremism, cultural alienation, and the need for the state to keep a lid on a potentially explosive situation in Xinjiang. Victor Gao is on the other side of this debate. He's a media commentator who frequently takes issue with Western media coverage for underplaying bombings by Uyghur separatists through the 90s and early 2000s, as well as the riots in Xinjiang's capital, Urumqi, in 2009.
When you report the situation in Xinjiang, you need to report about the threat which does exist in Xinjiang. I think the Chinese government has all along been consistent in expressing that there are no concentration camps, there are facilities, and these facilities are mostly meant for education and training purposes.
教培中心设置了服装加工、建筑装修、美容美发、食品加工等多种技能培训课程。
And the Western reports are fake news and misleading.
These are places where adults wear uniforms and where they don't go home at the end of the day, but sleep up to 10 a room.
Wake up. Don't fool the world and the people in the world with fake news.
They call it the three forces of terrorism, ethnic separatism, and extremism.
三股势力.
So they use that as kind of the base of what had happened in Xinjiang before the security forces moved in 2014 and made everything much safer. There was an hour-long CCTV documentary that was aired this past March, and they go into the 2009 Urumqi riots, some of the bus bombings that happened in the 90s. They interview the victims of those bombings. They show the burned out buses, dead bodies, in the wreckage.
频繁发生的恐怖袭击事件.
And they keep kind of playing this footage over and over, and then using that to justify this thousands of terrorist attacks number, which we don't have any specific reference for.
The Chinese government has been very effective. It's in its misinformation campaign. It is still ongoing as we speak. Xi Jinping's government has shown zero tolerance for political dissent. It would be difficult for anyone to come out and express sympathy for an issue as sensitive as the Uyghur issue.
For the past 3 years, Xinjiang has been administered by hardline officials who have intensified the campaign of propaganda, imprisonments, and so-called de-radicalization. This has come in the midst of one of the most stringent phases of national government under the leadership of Xi Jinping. We requested both the regional and national government for interviews. We got no response. The latest numbers compiled by human rights campaigners show that 58 Uyghur journalists have been locked up in Xinjiang. It isn't just Uyghur media professionals, though. Liu Guang is a Han Chinese photographer. He was picked up in Urumqi in November last year. There's been no sign of him since. Numerous Chinese journalists, editors, even academics have been swept up even when their work didn't actually take issue with Chinese policies.
Journalists are faced with dangers everywhere in the world. Many journalists are killed. And if you report about the pressures faced with journalists in Xinjiang, try to be objective. I don't think journalists, domestic or international, are faced with any other or more dangerous pressures in Xinjiang compared with any other countries in the world.
One of the most dramatic examples is Ilham Tohti, who's a professor from Beijing who had a website publishing content in Uyghur and in Chinese, and essentially trying to bridge that gap to try to have actual, real harmonious relations between the ethnicities. And he was detained and sentenced to life in prison.
Xinjiang is a major story that is not exactly breaking news. The camps were established 5 years ago, in 2014. But over the past 3 years, they've grown larger, taking in hundreds of thousands more Uyghurs, and they've become more secretive. Foreign journalists have finally forced the Chinese authorities to acknowledge the existence of the camps, which is a start. Just about everything else about the story, the people held there, the truth of what's happening to them, and the flow of information is under Beijing's control.
While the Chinese media continue to take their orders from Beijing on this story, one outlet has been vital to international coverage of Xinjiang. Radio Free Asia's Uyghur service is funded by the U.S. government, and it has a track record of breaking news on Xinjiang. It was among the first to present facts and figures to back up the rumors of the so-called vocational training camps. And it has since unearthed dozens of stories on the crackdown, informing foreign reporters and the Uyghur diaspora alike. For RFA Uyghur staff, the Xinjiang story hits uncomfortably and dangerously close to home. Many say they have had family members arrested. Aleem Saitov is the director of Radio Free Asia's Uyghur service. He joins us now from Washington. Mr. Saitov, thanks for joining us at the Listening Post today. Ever since day one on this story, RFA Uyghur has led the pack breaking news on Xinjiang. How did your organization first learn of this policy and the existence of these huge detention camps?
In early 2017, we began to realize, after interviewing Chinese officials, Uyghur officials, police officers, and local residents, that large numbers of Uyghurs have begun to disappear. Then through our investigation, by speaking to Chinese officials, we were able to confirm that in Kashgar Prefecture alone, more than 120,000 Uyghurs have been arbitrarily and extrajudicially detained in these camps. Then we began to pay attention to other areas as well. In Hotan Prefecture, for example, just in one county, nearly 40% of the male adult population were taken to these camps. Gradually, we realized the Chinese government were detaining large-scale numbers of Uyghurs and other ethnic indigenous population and building these camps throughout the region.
Covering this story from such a distance cannot be easy. What can you tell us about the methods you rely upon for your journalism?
We don't have an office in China, or we don't have stringers there, but we did have sources that we used to call. And our method is primarily based upon calling targeted, areas, regions, police stations, mosques, streets, etc. Sometimes it takes a few days. Then we can verify certain things that have happened, certain detentions, certain even deaths in detentions. So that's usually the method we use.
For many of your colleagues, your reporters, this story is personal. Given that so many of them still have family living in the region, what kind of personal blowback have they been facing?
China sees Radio Free Asia practically as an enemy station, and in particular the Uyghur service, because Uyghur service is one and only independent Uyghur media in the world. So Chinese government targets our reporters. Chinese government has detained parents, loved ones, and family members of almost all of our staff members. 6 of them went public about the detentions, and the others have been low-key. Chinese government frequently pressure and threaten their loved ones there, telling them that they should convey the message to our reporters, basically, to quit their job or provide information to the Chinese government. But this pressure and stresses do not distract from our work, the important work we are doing. And actually, that is the reason that we're doing more.
Ever since day one, since you launched in 1996, Beijing has seen RFA as a threat. What do you say to your critics who see your reliance on U.S. tax dollars for funding as having a compromising effect on your organization and the journalism it produces?
Yes, we do receive U.S. tax dollar, U.S. funding, but we are an independent and nonprofit radio station, and we make our own editorial decisions independent of U.S. government or other agencies. So we're not directly affiliated with the US government or its own agencies. We're completely independent in our operation. But that doesn't prevent the Chinese government or other authoritarian governments in Asia to label us as an arm of the US government or even CIA, but that's not the fact.
Aleem Saitov, thanks very much for speaking with us today.
My great pleasure.
The Chinese news media refused to cover the Xinjiang story until the reporting produced by international news outlets grew too compelling to ignore. The aerial shots of specific camps, the documents proving their ultimate purpose. That material was first broadcast on radio and television networks outside of China. But much of it was handed to those journalists on a plate by a handful of independent researchers practicing open source journalism, relying on online tools ranging from search engines to satellite imagery. Those researchers have played a critical part in the reporting process, and Beijing is onto them. It's now doing a better job of covering its tracks online, burying the evidence of its operations in Xinjiang. The Listening Post's Daniel Turi now on two open-source investigators and the role they have played in helping foreign journalists and the rest of the world understand the reality of Xinjiang's camps.
In the most heavily surveilled province of one of the most surveilled countries on Earth, almost every movement is monitored, whether you're a local or a journalist on assignment.
The first thing you notice is the extreme level of police presence. On every intersection, on every block, there is often a multi-story police building. There are security checks everywhere. And if you add to that the fact that there are also surveillance cameras on every street corner, kitted out with facial recognition technology, then you very quickly get to feel the sense of being surveilled, of being watched wherever you are.
According to a report by the Foreign Correspondents Club of China, 9 in every 10 foreign journalists who traveled to Xinjiang last year spoke of interference from the authorities. Some were detained by police. Others forced to delete data on their phones and other devices. Almost all the reporters, 96%, say they were visibly followed. Then there are the far graver dangers that face local sources. Last year, journalist James Palmer, formerly based in China, spoke about his personal experience trying to cover Xinjiang.
All of my Uyghur sources are gone. Sorry. I can't talk to people because they're gone. I cannot reach them. When we look at the lists of reasons that have been given for people to be sent to concentration camps, having had contact with foreigners is the single most dominant reason. I have certainty of one of my sources being sent to a camp. With the others, I don't know whether they've just cut off contact for their own safety or whether they're actually imprisoned. I stopped trying to reach Uyghur sources in about the middle of last year because the risk to them was much greater than any possible benefit of talking to them.
For its part, China says there is no such thing as so-called re-education camps in Xinjiang. A growing body of evidence suggests otherwise.
Despite the straitjacket imposed on reporters inside Xinjiang, coverage of the camps has surged over the past year.
Researchers have now identified and mapped nearly 100 suspected re-education camps and detention facilities across Xinjiang.
Much of that recent reporting is the result of investigations done from a distance by researchers using a method known as open source.
Open source is shorthand for the tools and data available to virtually anyone with an internet connection, a nose for forensic research, and in the case of this story, the ability to read Mandarin. Open source journalism is not limited by geography and respects no borders, which is why I've come here to Stuttgart in southwest Germany to speak to a researcher who's been investigating the camps almost 6,000 kilometers away in Xinjiang.
So you're one of the first researchers to use open source methods to investigate these camps in Xinjiang. What made you think that you would succeed using these tools where conventional journalists had failed?
The big advantage of this open source research is that you can uncover documents that speak of systematic policy, where the government itself says, we're doing this, and every local government under us is also supposed to be doing this. And oftentimes I was able to find this kind of document.
What's this particular document?
So this is the main supposed legal foundation for re-education. So when the Chinese say, we have established de-extremification centers based on the law, this is the document they refer to. Another document that I found talks about the goals of transformation through education. It even very blatantly says that transformation through education, in Chinese 教育转化, cleanses the brain from evil thoughts or from the thoughts of religion. That's a piece of evidence that speaks as much or more than 100 newspaper articles, because it basically proves that this is a systematic policy.
The documents that Zen's uncovered were evidence of state policy, but proving the camps had actually been built, enough of them to hold hundreds of thousands of people, required another open source tool, satellite imagery. That's where Sean Jiang, a Chinese student based in Vancouver, came into the picture.
I started my research last year when I heard reports that around 10% of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang had been detained or disappeared. I used a few keywords to search online and found lots of information, such as government tender notices for camps to be built. These documents contain the addresses of nearly 100 camps, so I searched on Google Earth and found the satellite images. They looked very different from civilian facilities. For example, there were barbed wire fences, there were watchtowers, structures that you'd expect in prisons. I found more and more information and so published it on my blog.
Satellite imagery and information collected by a researcher in Canada indicate that the camp has recently undergone major construction.
Documents found by Mr. Zen's mention psychological counselling for the children of parents taken to the camps.
A lot of mainstream media's coverage has built upon Adrian or Sean's work. You've seen Adrian's using government documents and hiring information to show the extent to which the security state has grown in Xinjiang. And Sean has used satellite imagery to show the camps being built almost in real time.
In the Financial Times, we've also used satellite imagery to look at the location and size of the camps. We've also used research by Adrian Zenz on the contracts that governments are using to buy new materials for the camps. And I think the really important thing about these kinds of research collaborations is that because the data is open, the journalists can also check what the researcher is looking at. And if needed, challenge whether the data they're seeing is representative of the region or how the data was chosen.
Communist Party officials, not usually known for their transparency, gave open source researchers a helping hand by leaving the evidence in plain sight. Now, Beijing is in damage limitation mode, trying to delete documents before investigators in Stuttgart, Vancouver and elsewhere archive and repost them. An online game of cat and mouse over one of the world's biggest stories.
I post my findings on my blog and I include the links to the original documents. But those links started showing up as invalid within a couple of weeks or even within a few days of me posting them. I could see the Chinese government was reading my blog and deleting the original sources.
The set of documents that disappeared basically describe the details of the camps, the security features, barbed wire, watchtowers, how big they are and what they cost. A lot of that disappeared. And so we were feverishly starting to archive websites and spent almost entire days on archiving hundreds of links. But I think in some sense, they pulled it too late. We already had the information.
By staying one step ahead of Beijing, open source researchers unearthed evidence about the camps that journalists on the ground in Xinjiang could not. But going up against a superpower, magnifying scrutiny of an already notorious human rights record, comes with consequences. All the more so, in this case, if you're a Chinese citizen.
Since I started my research, I've felt a lot of pressure from the Chinese government. For example, they've contacted my family in China. So in the near future, I think I will avoid going back home. Despite all this, I think doing this work is worth it, because there are so many Uyghur people detained. They've lost contact with their families. At least my research can raise awareness of this problem and help pressure the Chinese government into finding a peaceful solution.
Without the reporting that's taken place outside of the country, Chinese officials would have very little to answer for on the Xinjiang story. As we heard from Aleem Saitov of RFA Uyghur, Beijing is now saying that the vast majority of the Uyghurs interned have since been freed, their thoughts transformed. However, no evidence has been offered to back up those numbers. So you can expect that journalists working out of Washington and researchers combing the net for the truth in Vancouver and Stuttgart will be fact-checking that claim, as they have so many others in the coverage of this story. You've been watching a special edition of our program on Xinjiang and the media. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.